everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today's episode is episode 33, The Impact of Historical Coups on Middle Eastern Economies, with Mr. Harshil Savla. Mr. Harshil Savla is currently a junior at Indus International School, Pune in Maharashtra, India. He's very much interested in the field of economics, and he's currently taking IB Economics HL at his school, and he's very passionate when it comes to economics and learning about different economies of the world. And to be specific, he's very passionate about macroeconomics, and he's also very passionate about the region of Middle East. He has been to the Middle East many times, including his favorite country, which is the United Arab Emirates. He has traveled throughout the United Arab Emirates from Sharjah to Ajman to Abu Dhabi to Al Ain. He has gone to every place in the United Arab Emirates, and that's one of his favorite countries. And as a result, he's very much intrigued by the historical coups that have taken place in the Middle East. Not in the United Arab Emirates, obviously. It's a country that hasn't, I think it had seen a few coups, one or two, but I don't think it has seen a coup compared to its neighbors such as Libya, such as Yemen, and such as Syria, such as Iraq. But we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about the historical coups of the Middle East and their impact on the Middle Eastern economies right now. And thank you, Mr. Harshil Savla, for joining today's episode. And we're very glad to have you here with us today. And we're very glad to have an expert on Middle Eastern affairs here with us today. Mr. Harshil Savla, is there anything that you would like to add to the introduction?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and discuss such a crucial topic.
Thank you, Mr. Harshil Savla. We are very glad to have you with us today. And now let's get on to our topic of discussion, episode 33. The impact of Middle Eastern coups on the impact of historical coups on Middle Eastern economies. And to talk about the economies as of right now, I think it's very important that we talk about the historical coups that have taken place in the Middle East. And now, obviously, a lot of people, when they define Middle East, we are going to primarily define it as Middle East and Northern Africa, and so the MENA region. And we're going to exclude Iran for the purposes of a discussion today, because we're going to focus solely on the Arab countries, on the Arab nations. And so let's get into our discussion. And we're going to include Turkey in our discussion today. And the primary reason we're excluding Iran from our discussion is because Iran has a very intricate economies on its own, and we already had a podcast episode on Iran. And for this reason, we're going to exclude Iran for today. And now let's get on to the historical coups that have taken place into the Middle East. The first country that I'm going to provide a little brief bullet point history of the coup that have taken place in the Middle East. And Mr. Harshil Savla, Mr. Shahzib Karim, and Mr. Tariq Malik, you can add on to those, add on to the opinions, and add any extra information that you might have. So let's get on to our first country, Turkey. And so the first coup that happened in the 20th century, Turkey, was in 1908, and it was called the Young Turk Revolution. And one of the causes were the mostly rising dissatisfaction with Sultan Abdülhamid II's authoritarian rule. And there was also a desire to restore the 1876 constitution and strengthen parliamentary democracy, and the modernization movements and the influence of nationalist groups like the Committee of Union and Progress (CUP), and the coup ended authoritarian rule and ushered in a constitutional era. And it also catalyzed reforms and military-led political movement and internal divisions within the CUP, which led the groundwork for later instability. And in the 1960s, there was another military coup, and there was growing opposition to Prime Minister Adnan Menderes's policies, especially characterized on freedom and rising authoritarianism. And there was also a lot of economic instability and dissatisfaction among students, academics, and the military. And the results were the introduction of the military as an institutional overseer of Turkish politics, and the democratic leaders were executed, marking a significant break from civilian control. And the 1961 constitution was implemented to expand civil liberties. And now let's talk about Iraq. Iraq is one of the most interesting countries in the Middle East. It's also one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And in 1936, there was a coup. It was called, I think, the Bakr Siddiqi's coup, and it was caused by dissatisfaction among the military regarding civilian governance. And there was also a lot of calls for stronger state control and centralization. And this coup marked the first military coup in modern Arab history. Mind you, that Turkey is not an Arab country. And it also strengthened the military rule in politics and inspired future coups in the region. And in 1958, there was another coup, which was the overthrow of the monarchy, discontent with King Faisal's second's pro-Western stance during rising nationalist fervor. And the regional influence of Gamal Abdul Nasser's Arab nationalism and growing demand for modernization was also one of the causes of the coup. And the effects was that the monarchy was abolished, and the Iraq became a republic, and political instability persisted, and which resulted in the rise of Saddam Hussein later. And talking about Saddam Hussein, 1963 and the 1960s, there were coups that were led by the Ba'ath Party, and it was mostly because of resentment toward the policy of Prime Minister Abdul Al Karim Qasim, and there were internal factions seeking power in the wake of the 1958 revolution, and it also solidified Ba'athist influence and authoritarian trends in Iraqi governance, and this led to the rise of a new leader in Iraq in the 1960s called Saddam Hussein, whom we are very familiar in Dollar Dialogue. And Saddam Hussein became the vice president of Iraq in the 1960s and eventually became the president in 1979. And then there was Egypt. There was a coup in 1952. It was called the Free Officers Coup. And for example, and it was caused by the widespread dissatisfaction with the monarchy of King Farouk over corruption and military failures. And there was also a lot of rise of nationalism and leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser. And there was also establishment of the Egyptian Republic and emergence of Nasser as a prominent pan-Arab leader, which inspired similar revolutionary movements across the Arab world. And in Syria, there were a lot of series of coups in 1949 caused by military instability and weak governance after independence from French rule. And the military's desire to intervene in political affairs was also one of the causes of the coup, and it established a serious reputation for instability with numerous coups over subsequent decades and strengthened militarization in politics. And in 1966, there was also a new Ba'athist coup, which was caused by ideological rifts within the Ba'ath party between moderate and radical socialist factions. And it was also and the coup resulted in a consolidation of a radical socialist regime under Saleh Jadid. And it also shifted towards a more rigid state socialism. And in 1971, the father of Bashar al-Assad, Hafez al-Assad, took power in Syria. Then in Yemen, there's also a coup in 1962 called the Republican coup, which was caused by internal dissatisfaction with the Mutawallit monarchy, and it was influenced by the Egyptian-backed pan-Arabist movements. And in Libya, there was also the Gaddafi coup, which we're all familiar with in 1969, which was caused by a growing discontent with King Idris I's rule and perceived alignment with Western powers. And the rise of Arab nationalism also was one of the causes, inspired by leaders like Nasser. And the coup resulted in the establishment of Gaddafi's authoritarian regime, which lasted over 4 decades. And the Libyan foreign policy also shifted towards anti-imperialism and African unity. So this is a very brief history of some of the coups that have taken place in the Middle East in the past few decades. And so in summary, Middle East has seen a lot of coups. So what's your opinion on the coups that have taken place in the Middle East? And are there any coups that I didn't talk about or that you would like to talk about? Mr. Harshil Savla, Mr. Shazib Karim, or Mr. Arif Malik?
So, although we are focusing on historical coups in the Middle East and their economic implications, I really wanted to go in depth, particularly on modern events in Syria and the ongoing Israel-Gaza conflict. To start, the recent fall of the Assad regime in December of 2024 is a significant historical coup which reshaped Syria's political landscape. After over 5 decades of authoritarian rule by the Bashar al-Assad's government collapsed amid renewed offensives from opposition forces. The abrupt change not only marked a turning point for Syria, but also raised questions critical to its economic future and governance. The fall of the Assad regime, which specifically focused on support from allies like Russia and Iran, faced increasing internal dissent and weakened international backing because of its major use of chemical weapons, which were banned. Historically, the Assad's family rule was characterized by repression and economic mismanagement. While Bashar al-Assad initially promised reforms, these only benefited only those close to the regime and created a lot of socioeconomic disparities. Bashar was very famously known for his bias towards his specific community, which neglected many minorities across the nation. The civil war that erupted in 2011 devastated the economy, and just 13 years later has finally ended with a good result, ending towards the HTS group. Throughout the war, it led to a lot of widespread poverty as well as displacement, with huge amount of refugees fleeing towards Europe, especially in areas such as France, Germany, and more. The economy of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria heavily relied on 2 main sectors, oil and agriculture. Before the civil war, oil exports accounted for about a quarter of government revenue, while food production contributed similarly to the GDP. However, the prolonged conflict devastated these sectors. Oil production plummeted from approximately 383,000 barrels per day before the war to as low as 20,000 barrels per day in regime controlled areas by 2023, with much of the oil rich territory falling into the hands of rebel groups and Kurdish forces. This is very different from their neighboring countries such as Saudi Arabia as well as Iran, who really focus on oil and have been the major players of the oil production globally and have been the major suppliers worldwide. Um, in addition to the serious fall in oil production, agriculture was also significantly suffering, with cultivated land decreasing by 25% and agriculture production severely hampered due to the lack of access to essential inputs like seeds and fertilizers because of the high sanctions led by foreign nations. Following the fall of the Assad regime, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, otherwise known as HTS, is shifting Syria towards a free market economy, aiming to integrate the country into the global economic system. In recent news, we have seen their leader being more open and liberal towards the world, trying to show a redefined face for the group which is currently being labeled as a terrorist group because of their backings with historical backings with Al Qaeda, and their shift shows a sort of change in governance and authority with a more free and open vision towards how Syria will run their economy. This transition includes lifting previous bans on foreign currency and simplifying import regulations, which were previously mired in state control. HTS plans to focus on revitalizing key sectors such as agriculture, construction, and services, with an emphasis on private sector involvement as a means to stimulate growth. The reconstruction cost due to the huge war, which lasted over a decade, is estimated between 250 billion and 400 billion dollars, highlighting the urgent need for investment and economic activity, as well as support from NGOs and local charities as well as voluntary groups. However, the success of this neoliberal approach will depend on establishing stability and attracting foreign direct investment, which has been limited primarily to Iran and Russia, which has been signaled with the recent news and I'd say the recent governance being shown by their leader, who's in a major spotlight now because of his next steps in rebuilding the nation, as well as being ready to facilitate the infrastructure as well as economy needed for the influx of new refugees which will come in from those displaced. Um, the new economic model, while promising, raises concerns about potential socio-economic inequalities of the previous regime's crony capitalism, as HTS officials have not prioritized worker representation or broader social equity in their plans. It's really important to identify that HTS is still quite a new group, although they have had control over the small city of Idlib for about 8 years. It'll be quite a challenge for them to recognize the difficulties as well as the needs of all minorities and maintain equality throughout the nation, in making sure the economy is well stabilized while making sure all needs are also satisfied. Araf, that's all from my side for now. You can go further.
Yeah, I don't. I can
Thank you,
continue.
Mr. Harshil. Yes, Mr. Shazib, go on.
Yeah. I would also like to applaud Harshil for that. I think that was really insightful. And so, Araf, when you were also briefly talking, you gave a really insightful introduction, and you also touched on Turkey and Egypt as well. So, or Turkey, which you can also say. And so I think just to add more on what you had said, the 1960 coup was Turkey's first military intervention, toppling Prime Minister Adnan Menderes. And at the time, Turkey was undergoing rapid modernization with investments in infrastructure and agriculture. However, economic mismanagement and rising inflation created tensions in Turkey, leading to a political unrest. The coup disrupted progress, eroded investor confidence, and delayed Turkey's transition into a modern economy. And the 1971 coup, referred to as a coup by memorandum, came during a period of global economic turmoil and domestic stagnation. Rising unemployment and inflation led to policy adjustments, but these were largely ineffective at addressing structural issues. And the 1980 coup, however, marked a dramatic economic shift. The military enabled Turgut Özal to implement neoliberal reforms that transformed Turkey's economy. Trade barriers were reduced, encouraging export-led growth. State-owned enterprises were privatized, reducing government intervention, and the Turkish lira was devalued to boost exports. And now turning to Egypt, we see a different yet equally transformative relationship between coups and the economy. Egypt's most notable coup, the 1952 Free Officers Movement and the 2013 military takeover, each reshaped its economic priorities. Well, the 1952 coup, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Free Officers overthrew the monarchy, initiating a wave of socialist reforms. Land reforms redistributed wealth aimed at reducing inequality, and the Suez Canal was nationalized in 1956, bolstering state revenue and national pride. And while these policies initially spurred growth and infrastructure development, they also created inefficiencies. And looking at the 2013 coup, when Mohamed Morsi's government was overthrown, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's military-led administration introduced ambitious economic programs. Well, like the large-scale infrastructure projects, such as the Suez Canal expansion and the construction of a new administrative capital, aimed to stimulate growth. And the military took control of key industries, making it a dominant economic actor. And while these projects created short-term jobs and boosted GDP, critics argue that they neglected private sector growth and deepened inequality. And if we compare these two countries, Turkey and Egypt offer contrasting but complementary lessons on how coups shape economies. And to break it down, we can see that in Turkey, the 1980 coup facilitated a shift from state control to neoliberal policies, opening the economy to global markets. And in Egypt, coups often lean towards centralized control, with the military playing a dominant economic role, especially after 2013. And we can also look at the inequality and social impact. And both countries saw rising inequality post-coup. In Turkey, neoliberal reforms benefited urban elites, while rural populations struggled. And in Egypt, the military's dominance created an uneven playing field for private businesses. So I'd say that Turkey and Egypt's histories show how military coups can profoundly reshape economic landscapes. And while Turkey leveraged neoliberal reforms for modernization, Egypt relied on state-led initiatives. And both paths have brought successes and challenges, leaving behind legacies that continue to shape their futures.
Well, that's great, Shazib. I really liked how you focused in depth on Egypt as well as Turkey. I'd like to move forward towards Iraq. So, as Araf mentioned before, the Ba'ath Party coup of 1968 marked a turning point in Iraq's economy, introducing significant structural changes to its oil and education sectors. These shifts highlighted key economic principles such as dependency on a single resource, which led to a key identifier for nations globally in order to focus and make sure their economies were stable and for the future as well. Moving on, the focus of the oil sector. So, the nationalization of Iraq's oil industry in 1972 post the coup was a prime example of state driven economic intervention. By assuming control of oil production from foreign corporations, the government internalized the industry's profits, aligning with the principles of resource nationalism. The oil price surge following the 1973 oil embargo significantly increased Iraq's fiscal capacity. Government revenue rose exponentially, with oil exports comprising over 95% of foreign exchange earnings and contributing to approximately 60% of Iraq's GDP by the late 1970s. This influx of revenue facilitated increased public spending through fiscal expansion, funding large-scale infrastructure projects and social programs. However, this dependency on oil revenues created a classic Dutch disease scenario where the booming oil sector crowded out investment in other industries such as agriculture and manufacturing, leading to economic distortions and gaps. The opportunity cost of prioritizing oil exports became evident during the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 as military expenditures diverted resources from productive sectors. The war induced economic shocks and external debt, which reached $80 billion, further highlighted the risks of over-reliance on a volatile commodity such as oil. Although oil still plays a major part today, this incident showcased nations why you shouldn't be dependent on a volatile commodity as well, specifically for oil. So after the coup, the education sector also took a big toll. Investments in human capital were another defining feature of Ba'athist economic policy. The regime implemented significant public goods provisioning by offering free education at all levels and launching nationwide literacy campaigns. By the late 1970s, Iraq's literacy rate had risen substantially, with female literacy in rural areas reaching 50%, signaling progress in reducing educational inequality. The government also increased access to tertiary education, creating a more skilled labor force that contributed to industrial and bureaucratic efficiency. These policies aligned with the principles of endogenous growth theory, which emphasizes that improvements in human capital can drive long-term economic growth. However, the economic gains from this human capital investment faced diminishing returns during the 1980s due to the prioritization of military spending over education funding. Additionally, the capital flight and brain drain caused by war and sanctions in the 1990s further eroded the sector's contributions to economic productivity. In economic terms, the oil sector demonstrated the pitfalls of resource dependency and the volatility of primary commodity exports, while the education sector underscored the importance of sustained investment in human capital for economic diversification. The misallocation of resources towards militarization, representing a high opportunity cost, ultimately undermined Iraq's potential for sustainable growth and economic resilience. I'd like to hear more from Araf next.
Oh yeah, I would like to go on also, but like I think Mr. Arif Malik has his hand raised. Would you like to add anything, Arif Malik?
Yeah, apologies, the mic wasn't turning on. So, yeah, I agree with what you guys said, and I would like to talk about some of the root causes of why all these coups occurred. I think we talked a lot about the coups, the number of coups that occurred, but we haven't touched base onto the core reasons. And I would say the Middle East, in particular, has been a volatile nexus of political and economic turmoil, as it has witnessed over 50 coups over the past century. And these upheavals can be attributed to the confluence of socio-political instability, economic disparities, and external manipulation, all revolving around the central tenet that power is a strong magnet. And this Middle Eastern proverb that power is a strong magnet, I think encapsulates the core reason as to why these coups seems to be occurring repeatedly in the Middle East. And I would say many Middle Eastern states have historically exhibited features of patrimonial systems where power is concentrated in the hands of monarchs or dictators supported by their networks of loyalty and patronage. And I would say the lack of this pluralistic governance and widespread political repression often sowed seeds of dissent among the disenfranchised groups and the rival political elites. And this structural authoritarianism frequently precipitated power vacuums when leadership appeared vulnerable. This was seen in the case of Syria, when Assad regime was especially vulnerable, as Assad's main backers, Russia and Iran, were militarily exhausted, and this often caused this often prompts military intervention or revolutionary movements to fill the gap. So I would say that's one of the core reasons. And other than that, I would say the region's wealth, largely derived from the hydrocarbon reserves, has not uniformly benefited all segments of society, creating significant economic stratification. The resource curse, where reliance on abundant natural resource stifles economic diversification and leads to economic volatility, has exacerbated the socioeconomic inequalities. High employment, especially among the youth, is can be seen still in the Middle East, and subsidy cuts in times of fiscal austerity has often galvanized the public support for coups as a desperate push for redistributive justice and economic reforms. And I think this captures why some of the coups, for example, in Egypt or even in Yemen, have taken, or even Turkey to some extent, have taken place. Thirdly, I think another important point would be the influence of foreign powers through the Cold War and the continuing into the present. The Middle East is a strategic place, and superpowers and regional actors have often engaged in proxy warfare and direct intervention, supporting coups that align with strategic interest. This can be seen in Yemen with the Houthi and with the Houthi rebels. And I think proxy war is another factor for the coups that seem to be occurring in the Middle East. And I think another core point that I figured out through talking with some of my Arab friends was the ideological zeal, whether for Arabism, Islamicism, or secular nationalism. And this has often been driving the machinery of state coups. The Middle Eastern people are very proud of their identity. And I think coming from South Asia, I've noticed that as well. The Middle Eastern people, they love to show off their culture. And I think they like to show off their culture, personally, from my experience, more than the South Asian people. And I think this kind of pan-Arabism and competing is the reason for the coups, because competing ideological narratives provide a framework through which groups justify seizing power, particularly if the existing regime is viewed as ideologically incongruent with the perceived needs or values of the populace. And I think a good example of this could be seen in the corrective movement led by Hafiz al-Assad, exemplified the ideological driven coup where within the Baath party, which emphasized the need for more political stability and economic development. So I would say, in essence, the adage power is a strong magnet profoundly reflects the core reasons as to why coups seem to be occurring in the Middle East. And in my opinion, the coups in Middle East are the core reasons of as to why the coups in Middle East occur are vastly different from why the coups in other nations, other continents or regions such as Africa or even South Asia occur, because the Middle Eastern people are very different. And I think understanding their culture is one of the ways we can understand why the coups occur in the first place.
Yeah, Arib, I definitely agree with you. Another point I'd really like to add is the generalization on how Middle East heavy reliance on certain industries, especially oil and public sector employment, has significantly impacted its skill force in the labor market. The major dependency and over dependence on natural resources extraction, such as oil, has really shaped the region's workforce. The oil sector's capital intensive nature has led to a mismatch of skills where a large portion of the labor force is employed in low skill, low productivity jobs or in public sector roles that do not require specialized expertise. Because of this lack of specialization, these employees can't, or workers can't even go abroad where they can go to countries like the US, where they can work towards more specialized jobs because of the lack of expertise, which in effect affects the future generations of their nations as well as their economy. And especially because of the volatility of oil as a commodity, because of its rapid economic growth and its need globally from aviation infrastructural boosts, as well as a lot of dependency on I'd say gasoline and petrol cars. is now challenged by the sustainability goals such as from the SDGs of the UN, where electric vehicles are being prioritized globally. For example, with players like Tesla as well as Ola in India, because of this reduced dependency on oil, the supply as well as the price of oil from Middle East production facilities have been at risk and will be challenged in the future. The focus on a single sector, especially in the Middle East, has left many countries with a skill gap, where workers have limited exposure to or training in sectors like technology, manufacturing, or services. As a result, there is shortage of skilled labor in fields that could drive innovation and long-term economic diversification. For example, many young people in the Middle East are still steered toward public sector roles, which often offer job security but limited opportunities for career advancement or skills development. Similarly, the region's labor markets are heavily reliant on low-wage migrant workers in sectors like construction and domestic work, further hindering the development of a skilled homegrown workforce. The consequences of this sectoral dependency are particularly evident today. Despite efforts by many Middle Eastern countries to diversify their economies through initiatives like Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, the labor market remains skewed toward oil, construction, and government jobs, while the private sector, particularly in technology and entrepreneurship, struggles to develop. This creates a vicious cycle where workers continue to lack the skills needed for more advanced industries, limiting economic growth potential and hindering the creation of a dynamic, skilled workforce that can compete in the global economy. A major example of this is Saudi Arabia, who has recognized its global reduction in dependency for oil, and now it can be seen that they are building a big infrastructural project known as NEOM, for example, the line, which aims to bring in a lot of tourism to the country and to the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as they try to shift their focus away from commodities to tourism. And as there's a lot of news and a lot of articles which state that there has been very fast and very efficient labor towards the development of these infrastructural projects, which for one has been ongoing and successful, with one already done known as Sindala, an island of Neom.
Yeah, Harshal, and I think you brought up a really interesting point of the talking about the commodities and how Middle East is very reliant on oil. And I think that's very interesting to talk about, because we can also connect it to the politics as well, because political instability in the Middle East has frequently disrupted oil production and revenues, exacerbating economic challenges as well. So there are also a few examples as well. So I can think of, like, we can talk about the Libya's political turmoil, as after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, Libya's oil production plummeted due to a civil war and military control over oil facilities. And this instability hindered economic recovery and left Libya reliant on volatile oil revenues for over 90% of its GDP. And the Middle East's heavy reliance on oil has led to what economists call the resource curse. And many Middle Eastern nations fail to diversify their economies, leaving them vulnerable to fluctuations in oil prices. For example, during the 2014 oil price crash, countries like Saudi Arabia and Oman faced fiscal deficits and had to implement austerity measures. And public sector jobs, often funded by oil revenues, were cut, causing unemployment to rise. And oil wealth has often been concentrated in the hands of the elites, leading to economic inequality as well. And this has fueled resentment and social unrest in countries like Iraq and Libya. And governments reliant on oil revenues sometimes neglect other economic sectors, creating stagnant job markets and weak institutions. And when political upheavals occur, these weaknesses exacerbate economic crisis.
Thank you everyone for sharing the invaluable opinions. And I think based on our discussion, what we can say is that the historical coups on the Middle East economies had very vast amounts of effects. And I think that it is important for us to understand that, as Arif has highlighted, the culture of the region which has influenced the coup, and most of the coup were influenced by you can say nationalist sentiments. But I think that is for every coup that happens. Most of the coup that happens are justified by nationalist sentiments, because for the coup to be successful, you have to have the people on your side. And in my opinion, I think that historical coups in the Middle East have profoundly impacted regional economies, creating cycles of political instability, shifts in policy, and disruptions in development. For this reason, while this has reinstated foreign investments, particularly in the oil sector, it also contributed to unequal wealth distribution and unsustained elite dominance. Moreover, I think when we talk about Egypt, for example, in Egypt, the 1952 Free Officers coup led by Gamal Abdel Nasser also replaced the monarchy with a republic, which also implemented significant land reforms and nationalist industries to tackle inequality and reduce foreign economic control. And although these measures initially stimulated growth, inefficiency, state-owned enterprises, and mounting debt, in the following decades stagnated progress. And also Syria, I think, also experienced a series of coups in the mid 20th century, including the 1966 neo-Ba'athist coup, which amplified socialist policies such as nationalization and agriculture collectivization. And while these policies centralized control, they often have led to reduced foreign investments and economic inefficiencies, contributing to stagnation. And another country that I'm very deeply intrigued by is Libya. Libya's 1969 coup under Muammar Gaddafi has drastically restructured the nation's economy through the nationalization of the oil industry, significantly increasing state revenues and funding large-scale infrastructure and social programs. However, economic mismanagement, international sanctions, and Gaddafi's prolonged authoritarian rule undermined long-term growth. Meanwhile, Yemen's 1962 coup triggered a civil war that caused substantial infrastructure damage and economic decline, and efforts to rebuild and modernize the economy were continuously hampered by persistent political and regional instability. And while coups in the Middle East have sometimes catalyzed reforms and developments in the short term, they often left economies struggling with inefficiency, international isolation, and uneven wealth distribution. And this also highlights how political upheavals without effective governance can thwart sustainable economic development in the region. And I think one thing that I'm intrigued by is that while historical coups in the Middle East have reshaped political landscape and in some cases prompted economic reforms, the accompanying instability and inefficiencies often hindered long-term growth and equitable development. And given the recurring themes of wealth disparities, international interference, and governance challenges, how do you think these nations in the region can leverage their natural and human resources to break free from the cycles of instability and ensure sustainable economic progress? And I think that question applies to either Mr. Harshil Savla, Mr. Shazib Karim, or Mr. Arif Malik. Mr. Arif Malik, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, Araf, apologies, the mic wasn't turning on. So, yeah, I think what you asked is a really interesting question, and I don't think there's a really there's an easy way to answer this, because I think the Middle East is, of course, rich in natural resources, as I've mentioned, in hydrocarbons like oil, natural gas, and they hold tremendous potential for economic prosperity and development. However, with great power comes great responsibility. And however, even though the Middle East have a lot of natural resources, I think in the media we only see the success stories out there. For example, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, the Kingdom of Kuwait, or even the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Oman. But we don't hear about the other countries such as Iraq, Iran. I don't think we'll talk about Iran, but Egypt to some extent as well. Like these are very resource rich countries, and economically speaking, since natural resources are sort of price inelastic, they should have a lot of the Middle Eastern countries should have a lot of power. And since they are since Middle Eastern countries can extract their natural resources, they sort of have an oligopoly in the market. However, I think OPEC is the OPEC cartel is somewhat successful in that matter, but I would say that diversification of the economy is the main reason, for my opinion, and understanding of the economy of Middle East. And from speaking with other Middle Eastern people, the main reason for these coups and why Middle Eastern economies are such are greatly in danger because of the diversification of the economies. As we all know, the common financial saying, "Don't put all your eggs in one basket." And for much of the Middle Eastern economies, all of their eggs are in one basket, which is the oil and gas basket. And I think diversifying into other sectors such as renewable energy technology, which I think is somewhat controversial, because if they have oil, why would they do renewable energy? But I would say renewable energy could be potentially useful so that they don't run out of the oil. Manufacturing, I think, could be another way they can boost their tourism, as they have a lot of expat workers. Tourism is something that I've noticed in the Middle East. It's very prevalent in UAE and in Saudi Arabia, but I think other countries are still lacking in that sector. Additionally, I would like to talk about the investment in the human capital. I see a lot of smart people from UAE, for example, winning ISEF competitions in the science Olympiads. They're very, very smart people. But UAE, Qatar, or some of these other nations, I think, are exceptions, because I think other Middle Eastern nations, for example, Iraq, Syria, or even the other Levantine nations, their human capital is not that good. The people are primarily working in low sector industries, and we all know that in order to increase the average productivity of labor in economics, one thing that you need is human capital, and how smart the human capital is. And for much of these Middle Eastern countries, I think it's lacking. And additionally, I would say, other than that, the governance is another issue that I've noticed. And I would say that effective management of natural resources requires transparency and accountability, which many of these governance structures cannot display due to the rampant corruption, and also because of the fact that much of these nations in Middle East where the coups have primarily occurred were corrupt. So I think that's another issue. And I would say, other than that, political instability, I think we have talked about this, but I would say regional cooperation is something that needs to be talked about as well, because in the Middle East, I think many of the countries, they're somewhat aligned, but I would say they align primarily because of business reasons and not because of the regional cooperation as like, I don't think the people really see each other as benign, and I think it's rather a business relationship. So I think in order for the countries to succeed more, they need to go beyond that level. And other than that, I think everything I've talked about. I think from my point of view, one of the solutions would be to create a sovereign wealth fund. Many countries in the Middle East, including Kuwait, and I was surprised to find out through my research, even Norway have created these sovereign wealth funds to manage the surplus profits from these hydrocarbon revenues. And these funds, they actually invest in the stock market, in tourism, in sports, domestically, internationally, and they provide a cushion against the oil prices, and they generate income for future generations. So my advice and my solution would be, go and create more sovereign wealth funds, but also diversify the economy. So what do you guys think? How do you think they can really solve this issue?
Yeah, Arib, I think adding on to what you said, I would completely agree with you. And I think it's very tricky, and I would agree with what you had said, with what you had offered as well. But and my answer is also kind of similar to yours, because a significant factor in the economic consequences of coups in the Middle East is the resource curse, which I had previously mentioned. And this phenomenon occurs when countries with abundant natural resources experience slower growth, corruption, and political instability compared to resource poor nations. And in many Middle Eastern countries, all revenues are centralized in the government, making political control highly lucrative. And coups are often motivated by the desire to control this wealth, leading to cycles of instability. And so, after a coup, these neglected sectors often lack the resilience needed to support recovery, leaving the economy dependent on fluctuating oil revenues. So, despite the challenges, there are steps that Middle Eastern nations can take to mitigate the economic impacts of coups and build resilience and really utilize the resource effectively. And I think like countries must invest in sectors like renewable energy, technology, and tourism to reduce reliance on oil revenues, for example. And we can look at the UAE, for example. The UAE's investment in tourism and aviation has made its economy less vulnerable to oil price shocks. And we can also say that they can invest in human capital, as education and workforce development are critical for creating a resilient economy. Nations like Saudi Arabia and Qatar have begun investing heavily in education and innovation as part of their long-term economic strategies. And I think another interesting thing to talk about is, yeah, well, you had mentioning diversifying the economy, and like another part of it is, I had also mentioned tourism. So we can also talk about how Saudi Arabia, I don't know if you guys had seen, but Saudi Arabia, they announced that they're gonna host the 2034 World Cup, and Saudi Arabia, they're investing billions in their for football, in their Saudi Pro League, and they're really trying to attract, to like make the tourism sector bigger. And then by the time the World Cup comes around, they really want to make the nation they really want to make the nation ecstatic with football. And I also read that one of their goals is by 2030 they want to make Saudi Arabia a top three league in the entire world. And I don't know how realistic that would be, but because they're currently 56th right now. But yeah, they have really ambitious goals, and it really shows how Saudi Arabia are really trying to diversify their economy as well. And so yeah, talking about this, I also had another question for you guys. My question was, what would you guys say? Like, could diversifying Middle Eastern economies help reduce the frequency or impact of coups?
Yeah, so I really think what you said was true, and I think a major way to solve this over dependency on natural resources would be to diversify its market. I'd really like to take one of the examples of Qatar's World Cup in 2022 as an example. It really invested into the infrastructure for a lot of football stadiums, which boosted its image globally as a newfound tourism hub, as well as bringing in the infrastructure for new hotels and restaurants throughout the cities. Not only that, it also, the World Cup offered for a lot of employment, not just for the infrastructure but also for service sectors. um yeah, for services like hospitality and a lot more. What do you guys think?
Yeah, Harshal, I would agree. But so like since we were talking about diversifying their economies and everything, I also had like a question to ask. Maybe Harshal, you can answer this. So my question was, mm, sorry, my question was like, what would the risks be of using all revenues to fund recovery after political upheavals?
So of course, trying to just shift your economy into a diversified sector would pose a big challenge, because there'd have to be a lot of changes, not only infrastructural but also in terms of policies, as well as the labor and the skill needed for these diversifications. For example, if a country wants to go from the primary sector with a major focus on agriculture into these quaternary or tertiary sectors, it really need a skilled labor force, which would really have economic efficiency, as well as it would need employment in order to function. So there have to be a lot of guidelines set in place for this diversification to work. But in the long term, it's possible, although all these nations need to be very careful in the short term with how they plan their future.
Mr. Arif Malik, I see. Mr. Arif Malik, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think that Shazib asked a very good question, and I think another way that the Middle Eastern economies can leverage their massive natural resources is through, in my opinion, leveraging the technology for research management, because the advancement in technology can significantly enhance the efficiency and sustainability of resource extraction and management. And in my opinion, I think the Middle East can invest early on in the digital technology as well, such as the artificial intelligence, blockchain, and the Internet of Things (IoT) to optimize resource production, distribution, and monitoring. For example, AI can be used to improve oil and gas exploration and production by analyzing the geological data more accurately and predicting maintenance needs to prevent costly downtime. And additionally, I would like to say that much of the wealthier nations of Middle East, for example, Saudi Arabia or Qatar, they have very ambitious goals. And in my opinion, much of these ambitious goals, for example, in Qatar, for example, we talk about the 2022 World Cup, but we don't talk about what happened after the 2022 World Cup. Much of the stadiums are unused, and also I think reports came out from credited news publications regarding some of the controversial labor laws and labor contracts that were in Qatar. And I'm not blaming the Qatari government, but I would say like much of the, like Middle Eastern countries needs to be more cognizant about how they manage their labor, because much of the labor comes from countries like Bangladesh, countries primarily from South Asia. And the sad reality is that much of these laborers are enslaved in the kafala system, for example, in Qatar. And I think the Qatari government has taken initiatives to alleviate the issue and to mitigate the issue. But I think Middle Eastern countries needs to be more cognizant of how their laborers are taking place, because in my opinion it damages the international reputation. And also I think there are other concerns regarding the openness or liberalization of the Middle Eastern culture that some news medias talk about. I've noticed before coming to the podcast. And I would say like the countries, I think each country has their own sovereignty, and Middle Eastern countries, they can uphold their sovereignty in any way, shape, or form they like. And I think media often portrays Middle East as some of these as like a backwards society with very I would say like misogynistic or very patriarchal structure as media portrays it. And I would say like Middle Eastern countries, like some of them have tried to be more liberal and more open by allowing foreigners to dress more to dress however they like, and to not dress as modestly as some of the culture. But I would say like this is something else we should also keep in mind, because as of right now, like majority of the global economy and many of the rich countries are primarily Western centered, and Middle East is has started becoming rich like 10 20 years ago. And this is something I would say like a culture shock to many of the Westerners. And since Western economies have much of the capital, I would say like it's a very contentious issue, in my opinion, the culture differences. But I think that Middle Eastern countries have their economic and cultural sovereignty, and I would say like, and in my opinion, I don't see it as a negative light. I would say like by showcasing their culture, they're actually boosting their tourism and also showing a new part of the world that many of the Westerners or other foreigners are not accustomed to. And in my opinion, that difference is what makes the Middle Eastern countries even more beautiful, in my opinion, because the differences are not our weaknesses; the differences are our strength, in my opinion.
Yeah, Arif, I would totally agree with you, and I would also applaud you for that. I think that was very insightful, and I would completely agree with what you said. And I think since we're on the topic of this, I think another important factor and topic we can talk about is, like we can talk about what steps that the Middle Eastern countries could take to build economic resilience in the face of political instability. Because um, weak institutions exacerbate economic mismanagement and corruption, particularly in times of political turmoil. And I think there could be solutions to this. For example, they could implement anti-corruption measures and ensure that resource revenues are managed transparently through mechanisms like sovereign wealth funds. Like, for example, we can look at Norway. Norway's old fund serves as a model for how resource wealth can be managed transparently. And the rule of law could be like to strengthen legal frameworks to protect property rights, enforce contracts, and provide stability for investors. And another problem is political instability in one country often spills over into neighboring countries and states, disrupting trade and investments in the Middle East. And maybe like we can have they could have trade agreements, like they could establish trade agreements within the Middle East to reduce economic fragmentation and foster independence, which can discourage conflict. And another factor is that they could foster global partnerships, because the problem here is that isolation from global markets due to political instability limits foreign investments and trade opportunities. So they could implement investor friendly policies, reduce red tape, and provide guarantees against exploitation. And they could do partnerships for development as well. Like they could work with international organizations, for example, the World Bank or the IMF, to secure funding and technical assistance for economic reforms. So, since we were talking about this, I think I also had a question to ask, which was on my mind. Maybe Harshil, you could ask this, or maybe Ari Baraf could also chime in. But Harshil, so my question to you is, what do you think? Could investments in artificial intelligence, green energy, or fintech help Middle Eastern nations reduce their reliance on oil?
Yeah, Shazib. I definitely think these sectors can definitely encourage reduced dependency on oil for these Middle Eastern countries. Um, I can say that a big turning point for these industries, for the economies in the Middle East, has seen a lot of prioritization towards green energy. And again, coming back to my previous example of Saudi's NEOM, they propose a fully green energy and sustainable city, but also further investments into intelligence can develop economic diversification as well as innovation. So, as we were talking about historical coups earlier, because of this political instability and lack of free market, there's a restriction to entrepreneurship and innovation, which kind of restricts the creativity of these sole traders who would like to offer their services that can even be beneficial towards society. And because of these restrictions and the demotivation of these entrepreneurs, um, because of this over dependency on natural resources, further investments into intelligence can prove beneficial towards these economies for diversification. Not only that, job creation can be allowed into the tech sectors, for example, in data science, machine learning, and software development, allowing these countries to create their own workforces in these sectors, which can prove strong for the future. Not just that, it can help global competitiveness amongst other players. For example, India, which has a very young population, focusing a lot towards technology. Again, coming back to green energy, focusing on to green energy would again reduce their oil dependency, which is another volatile commodity, and can also focus on helping the environment in the Middle Eastern region, which is already known for the very hot temperatures as well as harsh climate from their desert region. Not just that, green energy even create jobs with engineering as well as sustainability and research development, as well as manufacturing, which is also quite a strong sector in Middle East's migrant workforce. And further, again, as Shazad mentioned, investments into fintech can offer economic inclusion and financial access, allowing more communities to be financially able and included into the economy, and empowering individuals as well as small businesses, for in rural populations to produce more, and provide further consumption towards society. Not just that, it would help SMEs as well as the startup ecosystem, providing microfinance and crowdfunding opportunities for these startups and small businesses to support entrepreneurship and economic diversification, creating a more inclusive and accessible financial ecosystem. Yeah, that would be pretty much it from my side, Shazib.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of you that it's very important that they invest in human development in order to have a very sustainable growth. And I think that the historical effects of the Middle Eastern coups are that. And I think one of the countries that I think we haven't talked about is like Lebanon. And Lebanon, while it has not directly been affected by coups, saw its economy shaped by regional instability and saving conflict, partly influenced by coups in neighboring state. And Lebanon's financial sector was once a regional hub, but political instability and external interference also disrupted its economic development. And the spillover effects from Middle Eastern coups, such as population displacement and shifts in trade routes, had long-term implications for its economic stability. Moreover, I think not all of the Middle Eastern coups are necessarily bad. For example, one of the coups that happened was in Oman in 1970, which saw Sultan Qaboos bin Said replace his father, and he took a more progressive economic turn. And Qaboos prioritized modernization by investing all revenues in infrastructure, healthcare, and education. And as a result, Oman experienced rapid economic growth and a significant rise in living standards. And unlike many of the coups in the region, this leadership change emphasized stability and growth, highlighting how carefully managed political transitions can create favorable economical outcomes. And moreover, I think again some coups are obviously have had a worse effects. For example, in Yemen, the 1962 Republican coup not only abolished the Mutawakkilit kingdom, I think it's pronounced Mutawakkilit kingdom, but also highlighted the severe underdevelopment that characterized the nation's economy, and the resulting civil war, fueled by Cold War rivalries and regional intervention, devastated the economy, and the agriculture production fell sharply, and infrastructure was severely damaged, leaving Yemen to struggle with recovery long after the conflict ended. And post-war rebuilding efforts faced significant obstacles, including ongoing political instability and tribal conflicts, contributed to Yemen's continued status as one of the poorest countries in the Arab world and in the world, and a country which has suffered many unfortunate food shortages. So what do you think of this new information, Mr. Harshil Savla, Mr. Shazib Karim, or Mr. Arif Malik? Oh, Mr. Arif Malik, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything? Oh, my apologies, it was Mr. Shazib Karim. Mr. Shazib Karim, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, Araf, no worries. And I think Araf, you brought up a very interesting point about Lebanon. I think it would be very insightful to talk about Lebanon. I'd say the situation in Lebanon, it's quite unique, and you had already mentioned the history and the bit of the backstory about it. I think to just add on to what you had said, Lebanon's economic crisis is one of the worst in modern history, exacerbated by years of political instability and poor governance. Well, the Lebanese pound has lost over 90% of its value since 2019, and this has led to hyperinflation, with the prices of basic goods skyrocketing beyond the reach of most citizens. And Lebanon's banking sector, once the backbone of its economy, has collapsed. People's savings are effectively frozen as banks impose withdrawal limits amid a severe liquidity crisis. And tourism and services, historically major contributors to Lebanon's GDP, have suffered due to instability and the ongoing financial crisis. And there's also rising poverty, because the World Bank estimates that over 75% of Lebanon's population now lives in poverty. And I think that just speaks volumes. And that's with basic services like electricity and healthcare becoming luxuries for them. And yeah, that just speaks volume, and it's kind of sad to see. And I'd say that Lebanon's economic collapse is a case study in how political dysfunction can have devastating economic consequences, even in the absence of a traditional coup. Decades of corruption and patronage networks have drained public resources and eroded trust in government institutions. And Lebanon relied heavily on external support without implementing structural reforms, creating a fragile economy vulnerable to shocks. And the confessional political system, while preventing outright coups, has entrenched power among elites, stifling reform and innovations. So we can, we can also kind of make predictions and kind of talk about Lebanon's path to recovery. And I'd say that while Lebanon faces immense challenges, there could be steps that Lebanon can take to rebuild it. And I think one of them is a move toward a merit-based political system rather than sectarian quotas could improve governance and reduce corruption. And Lebanon must invest in industries like technology, agriculture, and renewable energy to reduce dependence on remittances and foreign aid. And Lebanon's vibrant civil society and diaspora community can play a key role in advocating for change and driving grassroots initiatives. So I'd say that Lebanon's story is a reminder that political instability, even without a traditional coup, can have catastrophic economic consequences. Its recovery will require not only the economic reforms, but also a reimagining of its political system to prioritize the welfare of its citizens over sectarian interests.
Thank you, Mr. Shazib Karim. I think that brings us to a conclusion for today, which is that the historical coups of the coups in the Middle East highlights their profound impact on the region's economies, shaping everything from policy reforms to national trajectories. And while some, like Oman's 1970s leadership transition, ushered in economic modernization and growth, others, such as those in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, often entrenched inefficiencies, widened inequalities, and prolonged instability. And across the region, the recurring theme of disrupted trade, international interference, and unbalanced development reveal the critical importance of political stability and inclusive economic strategies. And the question remains: how can Middle Eastern nations balance prosperity and sustainable development to break free from this cycle and ensure long-term prosperity? And so, is that a conclusion that all of you would agree with?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Araf.
Same here, I'd agree.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for your agreements. And I think that brings us to the end of episode 2033, the impact of historical coups on the Middle Eastern economics. And thank you, Mr. Harshil Savla, for joining us on to this episode. And I really hope that you enjoyed our discussion. And we really enjoyed talking to you about these issues. And we really gained a lot of your insights. And thank you so much for telling us all of the important information that were fruitful in our discussion today. Thank you so much, Mr. Harshil Savla. Are there any final words that you would like to say before we depart for today?
Thank you for having me. It's really been an honor to be here and giving my insights as well as listening and deepening my knowledge with yours.
Thank you, Mr. Harshil Savla. We really enjoyed talking to you on these issues today. We really thank you for your participation. And that brings us to the end of episode 33, the impact of historical coups on Middle Eastern economies with Mr. Harshil Salva. And thank you to Savla, and thank you to everyone for joining into this episode and listening to our discussion. We really hope that you enjoyed our discussion today. And that is it for today. And we hope to see you next week with another very interesting topic with another very interesting guest speaker. Thank you and goodbye for now.